Welcome back to 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, KOAN, Hot Talk, the Joe Miller Show. We have a very special guest with us, Dr. Jerome Corsi, New York Times bestseller. Has had 2 at the number 1 spot. I think he's had a total of 6 books on the New York Times bestseller list. He's also a senior staff reporter for WorldNet Daily and a friend of mine. We've known each other for a few years. Dr. Corsi, thank you for joining us.
A great pleasure to be with you, Joe. Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Corsi, there are a few stories that folk have been following on WorldNet Daily about what's going on with Loretta Lynch, the proposed AG. Is her nomination in trouble?
Well, it's been delayed. Senator Vitter in Louisiana delayed the nomination after we briefed him and developed this information at WND. I've been reporting it for really since 2011. It's a large scandal. HSBC, which is one of the largest banks in the world, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, was created in Hong Kong and Shanghai going back to it was British bank financing the opium trade in the 1890s.
Wow.
And it's continued doing its drug laundering money. It's now headquartered in London. It has offices all across the United States. And in 2011, one of the HSBC officers in New York came to us at WND and had 1,000 pages of account information showing that HSBC was laundering billions of dollars for money for drug cartels and for terrorist organizations in the Middle East. We published this on WND. The scandal built. Ultimately, HSBC in December paid a $2 billion fine, just under $2 billion, which for HSBC was a slap on the wrist. It's like a couple days operating profits for the bank.
So was this an inside deal between them and DOJ? Is that why it was so minor?
And Loretta Lynch was the U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York and Brooklyn, and she signed the agreement for Eric Holder, which let HSBC off with a fine. None of the officers got prosecuted. I mean, this was, we didn't know how many billions of dollars they were laundering in drug money. And this is a bank with, blood on its hands. Here's people killed with the drug cartels, both for the drugs and the violence of the drug cartels, and terrorism being funded in the Middle East, some of the most vicious terrorist organizations HSBC was banking.
Who were some of the top terrorist organizations that they were laundering money for?
Any number of the Palestinian organizations, not ISIS, but some of the Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations, some of the organizations in Turkey. I mean, it was all through the Middle East. The Senate Permanent Banking Committee did a 300 and some page report on this and documented it, but nobody got prosecuted. So the people stayed in place in HSBC, and I'm quite convinced HSBC is continuing to launder money. We'll be writing about this again later in the week. And Loretta Lynch was the one who swept it under the rug. I mean, just to put it in comparison, Joe, let's say, people listening run a laundromat or have some small business, and you come into the bank and you are depositing in under $10,000 amounts the checks that you've got from your business and the cash. And suddenly the Department of Homeland Security shows up on your doorstep and accuses you of structuring your deposits as if you were a criminal money launderer and seizes your personal or your corporate bank accounts, which they do all over the country.
Right.
Mom and pop are at the mercy of DHS and IRS and the Department of Justice, but HSBC, maybe 1,000 branches in the United States involved in this money laundering scheme, moving money like a shell game. They would steal your ID, your Social Security number, your name as a current or former customer of the bank. They create hundreds of customer accounts in your name and Social Security number, run millions of dollars through it, and then close the account, and you never knew they were doing it.
So do we have any idea as to the amount, the total value of laundered money over the course of I don't even know how these log sheets, what was the time frame that they covered?
They were
the whistleblower
covered.
disclosed?
HSBC agreed to criminal violations from virtually the beginning of the Obama administration, like 2008, until they were caught. and stopped late in 2011. And my guess is $2-3 trillion.
Unbelievable.
I mean, the amounts of money going through the federal wire system are humongous, and the amount of money involved in drugs, the amount of money involved in drug cartels, the private banking scams that this bank, HSBC, runs in Switzerland that we now also know about. The John Cruz, who came out and gave us the data from an employee, got fired by the bank because he was researching this. Nobody at the bank wanted it investigated, including the compliance officers. They told him he was crazy and not to ask these questions. John Cruz got fired for developing this information and bringing it forward. And the bank employees are still there, kept their bonuses in place. The accounts still exist. And, Joe, when you think about it, this is something that, there's a movie on now running about Jim Webb, the journalist who showed in the Iran-Contra affair that the CIA was involved in the drug business. You can't run the drug business with semi-trucks full of $100 bills. You've got to get them into the banking system.
Right.
And
so, I mean, it amazes me that here you've got all these transactions going that obviously the federal government has the ability and, in fact, does actually watch. I mean, we know that, John Q. Citizen goes in the bank and decides that he wants to deposit over $10,000 in cash, or if he even moves that amount of money electronically, that's a flag. And you can expect that, out of so many transactions like that, you're going to raise the government's suspicion. Why in the world, or how in the world, I should ask, could you have this many transactions going on, up to $3 trillion, out of banks that have 1,000 branches in the United States, although they may not be headquartered here? Surely these wires did go through at least the United States, or through some of our agencies that had the ability to monitor it. Why didn't they get flagged before the whistleblower came forward?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent question, Joe. The question I keep asking is that it's obvious the federal government had to know about this and was doing nothing. I mean, it goes back to an argument that we are the drug cartels, that we are the terrorist organizations. I mean, we allow the banking organizations in the world to handle dirty money. And if we wanted to shut it down, John Cruz, who was a relationship manager at a New York branch, not a senior vice president, not an executive at the top level in the USA headquarters of HSBC in New York, if he could figure it out, you mean to say that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury couldn't figure out that HSBC was in Mexico taking in humongous amounts of cash, $600-700 billion, and moving it into the United States wire system and then transferring it in a shell game from account to account to account until it was transferred out to some distant location that was hard to determine? I mean, the pattern of suspicious behavior here, it jumps out at you.
It does, and so it's either a blind eye or active participation. Let me ask you this. Shareholders, HSBC, or senior execs connected to the Obama administration, have you uncovered any linkage to the current administration and those players?
Well, Joe, I mean, this is the reason that Senator Vitter has held up Loretta Lynch's nomination, because he's asking, now come on, Loretta Lynch and Eric Holder, you guys swept this under the rug. When John Cruz came to see me in 2011 early, he said he knew since 2009 the bank auditors were saying they knew all about the money laundering activity, and the bank had already put aside reserved $2 billion to pay fines. So the bank seemed to somehow know in advance what they were going to be required to pay. It looks to me like, you'll never get the internal documents on a FOIA request, or you can't even get the internal documents on Lois Lerner, out of the IRS. They suddenly lose all of her emails. I mean, you want to run a criminal government along with criminal banks and launder the drug money and launder the terrorist money, I guess as long as you're the cops, you can get away with it. That's what the story of Loretta Lynch is all about.
Yeah, corruption at the highest level. But do we have identified any players in HSBC at all? Are there any big names?
Sure. I've got names of the managers in New York who are still there, John accuses of being involved in the money laundering scheme. I went in with John Cruz to the Department of Homeland Security bank fraud groups in Manhattan, over on 11th Avenue and Lower East Side, and delivered this information. Nobody was ever prosecuted. No person was ever even criminally investigated for a prosecution.
Do you suspect in any way a Chinese government connection, or does the Chinese government have any connection at all to HSBC?
Well, Chinese government is, if you really want to get into the history or into the current involvement, there's some very excellent books that have been written showing that going back to 1948, when CIA was first created, and we had then a group called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The politics again dominated. We knew that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese at the end of World War II were making their entire living on running opium out of China. We turned the other way at the CIA and helped them do it because they were fighting Mao Zedong and the communists.
Right.
This has a long history.
Well, we'll pick it up from there. Next segment, Dr. Corsi, New York Times bestseller author, senior staff reporter for WorldNet Daily, uncovered this explosive story about money laundering. This occurred right under the nose of the feds, probably with the consent of the feds. More on that in just a few minutes. Anyway, Dr. Corsi, we were talking during the break about this HSBC money laundering scandal. Obviously happened under the nose, probably with the consent of the feds, up to $3 trillion laundered. They get a slap on the wrist as far as a fine goes, $1.9 billion. Loretta Lynch, the AG nominee for the Obama administration, fingerprints all over it. You know, we had on our program yesterday Chris Kobach, Secretary of State of Kansas. He's on the tip of the spear on this immigration fight. I asked him, I said, hey, why is the president doing what he's doing? Why is he allowing, what's the motivation in allowing all these illegals in that clearly are going to, at some point, impact the political process, perhaps to their vote? You had an interesting theory that we talked just very briefly about during the break. What is the connection between immigration and what's going on with this HSBC scandal?
Well, clearly the obvious reason that the Democrats want Hispanic illegal immigrants is because they believe they'll vote Democratic, and the Republicans, Chamber of Commerce centrist Republicans, Me Too Republicans like Mitt Romney and probably Jeb Bush, want the cheap labor. But the underlying reason I think Barack Obama and both parties understand to keep the border wide open makes the drugs more possible. You can have much easier to transport drugs across a border that's not being actively watched. And
I don't quite understand the connection.
Just think about the drug business from a practical point of view as if it were any other business. First of all, when you look at the quantity of drugs that are in the United States today, how'd they get there? They're all over the country. So there had to be a distribution system because the drugs are not typically, with the exception perhaps of some marijuana or methamphetamines or et cetera, are typically not produced here. They are, certainly the opium-based products, the heroin, et cetera, are imported. But yet, if you want to get them in Chicago or Boston or any city in the United States and small towns, they're available. So that requires a distribution system, and it requires a way to get them across the border. I've got to ask fundamental questions of, why are we growing more opium poppy today in Afghanistan than we did when the Taliban were in control? And why are U.S. military patrolling the poppy fields, keeping them safe in Afghanistan? The United States CIA has been in the drug business since it was created in Southeast Asia. I've written about this extensively. Others, like Jim Webb, who there's a current movie out about, by the way, which I really recommend people watch. We're on to the fact that you have drug connections involved with government at the highest levels for both money and for security, for the ability to get the drugs into the country.
Right.
The drugs wouldn't occur. They wouldn't be here.
There was an article last year, I think it was, Dr. Corsi, about how the United States had entered into basically a non-aggression pact with one of the big cartels in Mexico. In part, for intel, their operations in Mexico, they needed that cooperation, and that as a result, that cartel had a green light for basically its traffic into Chicago of narcotics. And, of course, that was considered to be a fringe article, but there's some pretty good evidence supporting it. Pretty scary thing to think that your government could be involved in the drug trade.
Well, go watch the movie. It's out right now. It's called Kill the Messenger. It's been a currently top-run movie. It's done very well. It is an excellent background. It's Jeremy Renner is the star in it, of Jim Webb, who was a reporter who did the expose on the drug connection in Iran-Contra with the CIA and wrote a book called Dark Alliance. I think he was ultimately killed as a result of the reporting he did. But the connection between the CIA, organized crime, and the drug trade, in other words, and the banks, you can't run the drug trade without all four being involved. And the intelligence agencies, since the British intelligence agencies in the 1890s or earlier created the Opium Wars in China to control China and created banks like Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, or today HSBC, to bank the money. These were understood connections that the government and commercial banks had to be involved if the drug trade was going to be anything big or serious. And, when I wrote a book called Why JFK Got Killed, one of the main points I made in the book was that Kennedy was not going to fight the CIA's lying war. He'd been to Southeast Asia, been to Saigon in 1950, and he knew that we were running drugs out of Laos and out of Vietnam, that whole Golden Triangle in Indochina, which it used to be called, since the end of World War II. And that the OSS and then the CIA, with what was the French connection through Corsica and Marseille, was the way that drugs were being brought into the United States through Santos Trafficante in Tampa and through Carlos Marcello in New Orleans. And this has been known this has been documented by numerous government reports. And still the American people somehow remain oblivious to the idea that the government runs the drug trade.
So, are you a legalization proponent? Are you thinking that by legalizing you take away the high cost of narcotics and therefore you undercut the whole trade itself, perhaps removing the corruption out of government? Or is that part of your proposed solution?
I think that the legalization has a lot of problems in terms of you induce more people to become addicts, although I don't think it's worse than the fact of the corruption that you get into, because you have a secret government being run. The CIA has used this excess money to do, assassinations, overthrows of government, back to overthrowing, Trujillo, or in the Dominican Republic in the Eisenhower administration, or Lumumba in the Congo, or possibly even JFK. You have to ask who pays for the guns in Fast and Furious, and who pays for the guns that were being run in Benghazi to go to the Al-Qaeda-affiliated militia that we supported to overthrow Al-Qaeda, Gaddafi. And the ties between CIA, a secret government cabal, drug runners, terrorists, and banks has got to be broken. And if that means legalizing drugs, then I'm for it.
So, assuming that you're right on this, what is the solution? Maybe legalization, but what else should be done at let's say there are a lot of grassroots activists listening to this broadcast and engaged in, political runs such as my Senate campaigns in 10 and 14. They want to know what they can do. Is it just an issue of getting the truth out, letting people know what's going on with their government? What's the action plan?
Yeah, I think you've got to get the truth out, and I think people have got to, start reading books like Dark Alliance and start reading books that really have documented this, and Iran-Contra. I'm going to give you a couple of the names here in a second. But there's plenty written on this. Peter Dale Scott, who has written books on deep politics, he calls them. They're available on the internet. They're mostly used and can be bought at reasonable prices. But he documents the CIA and the drug trade going back to 1948 and involved in the Kennedy assassination. This is not fringe stuff. He cites Senate hearings. He cites, the published reports from the federal government. It's well known. It's just not known to the American people. I read another book here, The Politics of Heroin, by Alfred McCoy. Outstanding book on how the CIA has been complicit in the global drug trade. These books are available. The information's out there, and when you look at this current situation with HSBC and Loretta Lynch surfacing again, where the bank admitted in the criminal indictment, they admitted in the statement of facts that they had a willful criminal scheme to launder money, HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, for Mexican drug cartels and Middle Eastern terrorist groups, all admitted. It's published on the Department of Justice website. And Loretta Lynch, Eric Holder said, well, that's fine, just pay us $2 billion. I mean, $2 billion is a joke to this bank.
Right. It's 1% of what they actually ended up.
A couple days' profit, cost of doing business.
So hopefully Senator Vitter has the backbone to allow testimony on this so that people can actually hear about some of the things that you're asserting. I mean, I can, and I will give you this 100%. I cannot see how this federal government could not have known. And why were they complicit? Why did they turn a blind eye? Maybe they were an active participant. Doesn't make any sense to me, and I think that people deserve the truth. Dr. Corsi, I appreciate your research, appreciate all your efforts. I'm sure we'll have you on again. Keep up the good work.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Joe.